Welcome. It's Friday Live. It's 1:45 in the afternoon, so it's time for me to be doing a half an hour live stream with you all. My name's Matthew Dashby Hughes. Now, normally, for those of you who have been watching a few of these Friday Lives over the course of the last few months, you would normally expect to see me joined by at least one other person. On occasion, we've even been joined by two. But today, it's just me on my own. And for those of you who are joining us because you've seen, I suppose, the post that I put out kind of supporting what it was I was going to be talking about this week, you'll know why. Because we're going to be talking about... well, it's kind of like a book club. We're going to be talking about some of the books that I've been reading over the course of the last 6 months in particular, that I think have been of particular value, and maybe you might just find a little bit of value in sharing them. And mostly, it's fair to say, those are books that follow a certain theme because they're the things that I'm interested in. So they're the sorts of things around psychology, I suppose empathy, human understanding, a little bit of, I suppose, sales, because, you know, who knew I'm quite interested in business growth. And, oh yeah, growth is a euphemism for selling more stuff, or at least selling it for more money. So that's sales, right? So I'm quite interested in that. I'm also interested in business and business management and leadership and other sorts of things to do with organizational structures and doing things in a nice ethical way. So there's lots of stuff around self-management and ethics and things as well. Now, full disclosure before we start, this is not an exhaustive list of all the things that I've read, even in the last 6 months, because frankly, I consume an awful lot of material. That's not to be, you know, anything other than somebody who spends a lot of time with his Audible account kind of playing on his earphones. And yes, I do tend to play it at least 1.5 times the speed, if not 1.8 times the speed, so that I can basically get to the point, because I tend to find that, yes, okay, I might be listening to relatively difficult psychological concepts as read by Pinky and Perky, but you still get to the point. You get what you want. One thing I would urge you all to do is, if you do start to kind of take in this kind of level of content, and some of you may already do this, it's always a really good idea to have some kind of a strategy as to how you're going to, I suppose, internalize what it is that you've read. Now, one of my particular favorite things to do, and this might work for you, it might not, but I'll share it with you anyway. I've got a whiteboard here. Now you can see there's lots of stuff on my whiteboard at the moment. It's kind of in use, but generally speaking, as I'm consuming this content, I'll probably clean that whiteboard off and I will write up a lesson plan as though I'm going to teach somebody exactly what it is that I've been learning. And by doing that, if you learn something well enough to be able to teach it, then generally speaking, you internalize it really quite well and quite quickly. One book that I haven't read in the last 6 months, and which I did make a promise to Roy Johnson, my colleague, that I would mention, because otherwise he wouldn't even watch this if I didn't mention it. He told me I won't watch it unless The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is mentioned. So I had to get out my original pen paper back of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It make him slightly jealous because, you know, it's actually signed by Douglas Adams. Anyway, moving on. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about 12 of the 20 plus books that I've read over the course of the last 6 months or so. And those 12 are some of the ones that I think are really good. Some of them I've reread. Some of them are on my second or even third time through. But they're all, I think, in their own way, something that's really worth listening to, or reading, listening to, because Audible is a really valuable thing. And frankly, all of these are available on Audible. So I'm going to share some titles with you. Let's have a little look at what some of these even look like. So here we go. The first one, I suppose, is what we call Ego is the Enemy, which is by Ryan Holiday. Now, Ryan Holiday is a really good writer. Good because he's succinct and to the point and clear. There's some writers, particularly it's fair to say within the business space, you get the sense that they're very pleased with themselves. They really like the way in which they're writing, and they want to show off just how many very long words they know. Now, I don't have a problem with polysyllabic words. You know, I'm not exactly dim. I'm quite capable of understanding what you're saying. It's just, I think that you don't need to show off. It comes across as self-pleasuring. Ryan is the opposite of that. He is, I suppose, in congruence with his Stoic idols, somebody who actually really quite likes to be simple and to actually tell it like it is. So some really, really cool things here within this. You've got some great takeaways, and really, for me, I think the power of this is all about how he talks about I suppose, three different phases that we're in any given time. You've got aspiration, success, or failure, and you're always in one of those three phases in any kind of thing that you're doing. And he talks about the fact that as you go through all of these three phases, in order to be able to progress quickly, you need to be open to feedback, you need to be able to develop, and you need to be able to learn from your own failure. So what I particularly like here is he's using ego in its, I suppose, layperson's definition. This is not like the ego as in the different ego states within the human psyche. This is ego as in being egocentric, as in being slightly narcissistic. Okay, so what we're talking about here is if you actually are vulnerable and humble enough to be open to learning, then you can actually progress quite quickly. And also you can recognize that failure is a teaching moment. It's something that you can learn from, and that failure is in fact a prerequisite for success, because you're going to have a number of failures on the road towards any given success. And I particularly like his emphasis on always being a student. Obviously I would do. I'm in professional training and development. That's part of what I do for a living. So, obviously I'm going to quite like that idea, but I really like his emphasis on it as being a necessary prerequisite for success. And one thing I really loved, and this is my biggest takeaway from this book, was there's an old Tim Ferriss quote. I think it was Tim Ferriss anyway. He talks about we're the average of the 5 people we surround ourselves with the most. Well, Ryan Holiday here, he talks about actually having 3 people around us, I suppose as a minimum, but he puts some science around what those people should be. And he talks about one being a mentor, somebody from whom you can learn. And Marcus Kauke actually has got a great quote about this. He talks about find somebody whose past looks like your future and make them your mentor, learn from them. I love that. I think that's really powerful. The second one should be like a peer, almost like a worthy rival, somebody who you can benchmark yourself against. And the third one should be a student, somebody that you in turn can actually teach. But the key thing that comes through from all of this thing is it's about the basic Stoic principles. And in fact, Ryan's written a bunch of other books. There's Lives of the Stoics. There's The Obstacle is the Way. There's a bunch of them. And actually, they're all really worth reading. But this, for me, is probably his best one. And it's also one that I read in the last 6 months. So it's relevant. And it leads beautifully into the second thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is actually, I suppose in some ways, it's a bit of an outlier, because this isn't actually a book. This is available in audio only. It's called The Power of Vulnerability, and it's by Dr. Brene Brown. And the reason I really like this is because although it's a series of 6 lectures, it plays really well. And actually, she's a very articulate speaker. She's a storyteller. She's funny. She's a raconteur. But the points she's making in these lectures really, I think, almost land better than the same points when you're reading them in the rest of her written books. And her books are great. I mean, they're well worth reading. But for me, this is a really, really powerful kind of summation of a lot of her work around the idea of vulnerability as a source of strength, really. Because if you think about it, vulnerability is very often mistaken for weakness because we perceive it as that, particularly in Western society. Whereas actually it's not. Vulnerability is something that takes real courage and real bravery. And if you think about every kind of real brave act that you've ever done or you've ever seen done, there's an element of them making themselves vulnerable, exposing their soft underbelly. Which is one of the things that makes it brave, So there's a really powerful thing here. And she talks about the difference between shame and guilt, which really, for me, plays into something within Sandler. We teach a thing called IR theory, which is David Sandler's, I think, a great gift to the world, where he talks about the separation of our sense of identity and our sense of self-esteem away from our performance within our roles. Because in Western society, we tend to have tendency to over-identify our role with who we actually fundamentally are. I screwed up does not make me a screw up. It means that I screwed something up, and there's a big difference between the two things. Really powerful stuff, well worth a read. And vulnerability and empathy also then leads me beautifully into the third one. Now this, I mentioned Marcus Kauke earlier on. If you don't know Marcus's podcast, Welcome to the Inquisitor, I urge you to go and suss it out and find it out. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of episodes available on Podbean. I think it's available on Apple Podcasts and various other, basically the podcast app of your choice. You will find it. Marcus Kauke is Cauchi, and Marcus is spelled with a C as well. You'll find him. There's not too many Marcus Cauchys around. He's recommended at least 3 of the books on this particular list, and this is one of them. And I have to say, this is probably one of the best books that I've ever read. Actually, this would be on my desert island discs. This is a terrific book. It's about empathy, about truly listening, truly making somebody feel heard and understood, seen, heard, felt, and creating genuine human connection. And I suppose one of the things that really came away for me as a big takeaway is the way that we relate to our emotions quite badly as human beings. In fact, it's fair to say that as human beings, we're pretty rubbish at understanding human beings, including ourselves. You know, we're not all that great at looking in the mirror and understanding what it is that we're really looking at. In this book, he talks about, I suppose, some of the elements of being able to listen to somebody properly and truly listen and truly empathize with what it is they're saying, so that you can help them to self-discover what it is they're truly feeling, so you can help them to label their emotions. And what a powerful form of connection that actually delivers. Now, this is not something that one should manipulate for the wrong reasons. It's to be done ethically. It's entirely designed to create genuine connection. And this can be helpful in multiple different areas. In fact, Mark Goulston himself talks about various different jobs that he's had, working not only as a psychotherapist, as you'd expect, marriage counselor, hostage negotiator, and now sort of a negotiator for large companies and things, or helping large companies with negotiations. And all of those things have got quite a lot of read across, mainly forging genuine human connections. On which subject, that takes me neatly into this next book, an absolute classic, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, who won his Nobel for the frankly groundbreaking work that he did around cognitive biases. And there's a lot of that work that's reflected in this book. This is really about the difference between what we would, I suppose, traditionally call the unconscious mind, which is where an awful lot of the heavy lifting of our day-to-day thought goes on. And I use the word thought advisedly there, because it's not thought in the sense of what we would recognize as rational cognitive thought. It's the sort of sensory impressions and general kind of heuristic decisions that we make, you know, almost on an instinctual level. Certainly an awful lot of what we do, we're not really aware of why we're doing it. And when we then sort of subsequently try to rationalize why we did it, that rationalization is largely wide of the mark, which leads you very beautifully into the next book here as well. It's almost like there's a theme with what I read here, because the next book is a book called Predictably Irrational. Now, this is good fun. I mean, there's some really, really good stories in here. I really like this book. Dan Ariely, who wrote it, again, a bit like Ryan Holiday, he writes really nicely. There's some real fun to his writing. There's a bit of a lightness of touch to it. But what this really does is it kind of shines a spotlight on the ridiculous notion that human beings are in any way rational. I mean, it's a little bit unfair to say that there's no rationality to us at all, but it certainly plays a tiny part in most of our decision making. And there's an awful lot of really interesting areas here, which is well worth reading. You know, we are emotional, instinctive, creative, irrational beings before we are ever logical. You know, the rational part of our brain comes in way later. We feel long before we think. We then sort of rationalize what it is that we were feeling and try to pretend to ourselves that it was logical. So this is a super interesting book. And all of that stuff, you'll see there's a theme emerging. You know, it's about self-management and human connection and the ways in which human beings interact with each other. And frankly, you know, if you don't read these sort of psychology books, then that's fine. It's not your area, and I get it. But generally, you know, we've all got to deal with human beings. Even if you're a hermit living in a cave, you've got to deal with at least one human being, and that's you. So it's a good idea to kind of understand a little bit more about the 3 pounds of organic matter that sits between your ears, and it's potentially your greatest ally, but very often it's actually your greatest enemy at times. And to that point, we can then start to build on this and make it, I suppose, a little bit more practical. Now, this is the second of the books in this series that was recommended to me by Marcus Cauchy, and he recommends it regularly on his podcast as well. This is a book by a guy called Bob Moesta, and it's Demand Side Sales 101. Wow. This is absolutely required reading. This is about thinking as the customer. And I think the most profound insight I've heard in a very long time is contained within these pages. And that is this: people do not buy what you're selling. People don't buy your product. They don't buy your service. What they do is they rent an outcome. They rent an outcome until something better comes along that gets them to that outcome, either quicker, more efficiently, cheaper, better, whatever that better looks like in their world. But that's the point. It's their world. You've got to think as the customer, think through their eyes. Demand side, as in you've got to be on the side of where the demand is and understand that demand, which is very congruent with the way in which we teach sales within Sandler. It's about understanding the customer and recognizing that actually, you know what, not every person that you talk to is going to qualify to be your customer. They don't all have the problems you can solve. And sometimes even when they do have the problems you can solve, the problem isn't a big enough problem to solve in their world for them at that time. And so you should then be very ethical and equitable, and you should, part company as friends and do so in a simple, ethical way. And this, again, we're talking about sales. Well, sales is about behavioral change. You're wanting somebody to change their behaviors, or it would be helpful for them to change their behaviors in their world. But whether it's sales or it's management or it's even self-help, I guess, if you want to change your own behaviors, you want to exercise more, maybe you want to eat less or eat more healthily, or, simply you just want to do less of the bad stuff and more of the good stuff, whatever that looks like. Whatever that looks like, it's a good idea, again, to understand the human psychology of behavioral change. And this book, Tiny Habits by B.J. Fogg, is flipping magical when it comes to that. It's a really, really good book. Now, this is where we talk about the fact that for any kind of behavior to take place, 3 elements need to be present. And those elements are these: the prompt or trigger, as it might sometimes be called; ability, which I suppose means your capability, your competency to do it, but also that there's no barriers in the way of you doing it. And the third thing is the motivation. Now, very often we talk about trying to change somebody's motivation to do something. And, that's interesting because actually of these 3 things, the motivation is the one that's hardest to change. The 2 that are actually easier to change are the prompt and the ability. If you make something harder to do and you remove all the triggers to do it, well, actually, even if your motivation to do it is quite hard, you've now made it really difficult to do it, which means you're now reducing the chances of them actually doing that behavior. Similarly, though, if you make the triggers and the ability to do it, really, really high prevalence, even if there's relatively low motivation to do it, it'll get done. So it's almost like a reciprocal arrangement between those 3 things. And actually, if you Google B.J. Fogg's behavior model, you'll see it as 2 axes, and then there's a line showing the trigger piece of it. It's a really interesting model, and actually, B.J. Fogg's from Stanford University. He's a behavioral psychologist. One of his students was one of the guys who went off and then created a little company called Instagram, based on everything that he learned from this course. So worth a thing or two. He knows what he's talking about, does this chap. And talking of knowing what you talk about, I've got a shout out to Eloise Leeson as well, because she recommended that I read this book, and what a great book it is. It's been around for a long time. To my shame, I hadn't read it previously. I read it this year, and I'm actually glad I waited till this year, because there's an updated version that came out in May this year, and that really was a very, very powerful addition, because it's actually gone from simply 6 elements of influence to now 7 elements of influence. So he's actually added comprehensively to it. He's also added in a bunch of very relevant topical things. So he talks about the influence stuff that went into the Trump campaign, without getting all political about it. I mean, certainly it's academically interesting as to how that happened and all that kind of thing. So this is a really interesting book. We're talking about, relationship stuff where basically, you're talking about relationship based around reciprocity, give and take, like the Emerson's law of compensation, that side of things, unity, which is actually being part of a group and liking one another and actually wanting to be liked and all that kind of thing. You've then got the intellectual justification for any decision. So you get authority. So basically celebrity endorsements are quite important here. Scientific evidence is quite important here. Social proof. So other people that you respect and like saying this is a good thing. That all goes to it. And then you've got more of the urgency and action side of things, which is based on, actually committing to doing something, then doubling down on that, being internally consistent with your own decision making. And also there's an element of scarcity there as well. Scarcity marketing is a really good thing. I'm going to take a brief pause now at 2:05 and just have a quick look in the chat, because I've seen a couple of things popping up here. So Bruce is saying pen is ready at the list to order from Amazon. Thank you very much there. Great stuff, Bruce. there you go. Lots of good stuff. Rent and outcome. So that's where that phrase comes from, says LinkedIn user. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great one, isn't it? I really, really like that. It's absolutely terrific. So yes, good stuff. The next book is actually the third of the books that, again, I got a recommendation from Marcus Kaukion. And this is a book called Range, and I reread it quite recently, following some conversations with a friend of mine called Peter Harris, who you may have seen my interview with Peter in the last season of the Friday Lives. Peter is the MD and owner of the Alternative Board in Staffordshire. And what I love about Range is it's talking about the power of generalists versus the power of specialists. Paul Raisbeck, another friend of mine, he also talks about this quite eloquently as well. In fact, far more eloquently than I ever could. And really this is, you take certain people in certain fields, the Tiger Woods or somebody of that nature, and they're absolutely superb at what they do. They're super specialist in one area and they are brilliant at that one thing. But if you that's working within a finite system, so there are simple rules that consistently followed, and you can become a true expert and excel as a specialist in a finite system. However, in an infinite system or an infinite game, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, a clue as to what another title that's on this list, in an infinite system, in an infinite game, actually having a range of experience and being able to see through multiple different lenses and think from different points of view is absolutely essential for good quality fast decision making. Now you can, I suppose, artificially create range by having a diverse range of people around a board table, providing it's properly managed. And diversity and inclusion here is not just simply tokenism. What we're talking about here is genuine diversity, where you don't just recruit in your own image, or your own image only weaker, which is what does happen sometimes. In fact, what happens quite often, let's be honest, but you actually have a real range of people around the table, nice gender split, ethnicity split, class split, so different backgrounds, people from different backgrounds. So not everybody went to the same university, learned the same stuff and talks in the same way and parrots the same blind spots without ever shining a spotlight on them to recognize that they're even there. Okay, so Range, really good book, David Epstein, simple read, nice, good, fun stuff. There's a fourth one that Marcus recommended. There you go. I credit him with 3 and there's actually 4. So actually 33% of the things on this list came from him. So there you go. You definitely should listen to his podcast. The Road Less Stupid. Wow. if you want something on the top of your desert island disc, well, frankly, this one just probably pips the Just Listen one for me. The Road Less Stupid, apart from the fantastic title, because let's be honest, that is a great title. Keith Cunningham's book is required listening for anybody who wants to avoid paying what he calls the dumb tax. On an awful lot of things. He's got some scar tissue from having been around the block a few times, but this is the kind of block where he hangs out with people like Warren Buffett. He knows a few people, he knows a few things. He's not a dafty. And one of the key things here is the concept of thinking time. Now, this is a brilliant concept. It's an idea where in a ritualized manner, on a weekly basis, you sit down for a clear 45 minutes, with no electronic distractions, no bells and whistles, no things getting in your way, no interruptions. You make it a ritualized experience. In his world, he's got a particular chair that he sits in. He's got a yellow legal pad in front of him. He's got a number 2 pencil, and he writes a question at the top of that page. And then for 45 minutes, he answers that question, following it logically wherever it could possibly go, to its sometimes almost ridiculous extremes as to where that question could possibly go. And by doing this, he enables himself to kind of play the movie all the way to the end in his head. So he really thinks things through in a way that most of us are guilty of not doing. And it's almost like a self-coaching technique. Absolutely brilliant. Very good. We've got another comment just come in here. Very much enjoyed The Road Less Stupid. Fantastic book for making you take a step back and getting you to think about your business. I totally agree with that. Thank you very much indeed. That's great. And yes, I did sort of mention that there was another book here that was likely to come up, The Infinite Game. Now, Simon Sinek, whatever you think about Simon, some people kind of dismiss him as being somebody who's very good at being self-publicizing and, being a self-marketeer. And there's probably some truth in that, but he's also a bloody good writer and a great communicator. And frankly, the concepts that he puts across very clearly, and I really like. Start With Why is seminal. It's absolutely fantastic, really, really good stuff. There's some really powerful books here. But The Infinite Game, The Infinite Game is a really, really impressive conceptual book. And I think reading this actually is a bit of one of those kind of mindset changes for me. It's where you realize that actually we're playing in the wrong sort of game quite often in business, particularly in the, I suppose, business arena that we currently inhabit and have inhabited really since the 1970s, when this kind of Milton Friedman, the good of a company really can be measured by the value that it brings to its shareholders. Shareholder value is not a good proxy for whether or not the company or not is a good company, because ultimately that in the way that Milton Friedman put it was that actually shareholder value, providing you are acting within the law. Now, that's fine, but actually the law doesn't always capture everything that is moral, and you can push the boundaries of the law and sometimes be deeply unethical and drive your value for shareholders. Within that model, when Facebook did naughty things with Cambridge Analytica, Facebook was being perfectly okay. And yet all of us would agree that Facebook was not being perfectly okay. Well, I say all of us, most of us would agree that Facebook was not being okay in that way morally. Certainly wasn't being a good company. So it's looking at this from a much wider thing and looking from an infinite perspective as to what the real value is. And it's certainly not measured in terms of monthly and quarterly results. It's measured in terms of the greater social and community and communal good and what you produce. It's a much more profound definition of good. And I think that's an incredibly powerful book. The last book that I just wanted to share with you before we finish today, and we are coming up on the end of it today, so I have just timed it just about right, is one that kind of doesn't really fit with the others, but it's nonetheless a book that I thought was incredibly powerful. And it's now a book that I recommend to every single one of my clients who is a small to medium enterprise or just starting out or a solo entrepreneur, especially if they don't have a financial background. Because certainly I think most accountants are going to read this and go, no, you can't do that. You can't, no, that's not right. But actually, what I love about this is Mike Michalowicz's Profit First is an accountancy book for non-accountants. And it's about how to manage a business in a way that is congruent with how your brain actually works. If you leave something to the very end, like the bottom line, profit, if you leave it to the very, very end before you take it out, well, you're psychologically telling yourself that's the least important thing here. So right from minute one, he's saying you should be taking a little bit of profit out right away. And then everything else that's left after you've taken that profit out is how you pay your bills and all that kind of good stuff. The key thing for me is that this is a really profoundly powerful concept. And I also learned a new psychological law from it, which I particularly like, which is Parkinson's law. Now, some of you probably came across this years ago, but I like this one. And it's about how, you will work with whatever you've got in front of you. And this is the reason why you're able to do about a week's worth of work the day before you go away on holiday. It's also the reason why you can take a toothpaste tube and basically the bulk of the tube will last you about 2 weeks, and then you get down to that last little bit where you need to squeeze your thumbs in behind it, and that last little bit will last you about 2 weeks as well. So you'll work with whatever you've got. You work within the means that you've got, and that's why there's phrases around that ring true, like if you really want something doing, give it to a busy person, because they'll find time for it. They're capable of doing that. That's just how it works. So these are my 12, but what are yours? What are your 12? I really would like to hear from you. Listen, I read an awful lot of stuff, as you probably gathered, and selfishly, I want more stuff for my reading list. So, please share in the comments, let me know, tell me what it is that you're thinking. What do you read? What's really profoundly affected your thinking, whether it's a podcast, a book, whatever it is. I'm really keen to learn and frankly, always interested. And maybe I'll do another one of these in 6 months' time, and I'll be sharing some of the books that you've recommended to me. But that's us for another Friday Live. I hope that was of some benefit. Maybe some of those books actually rang a few bells with you and maybe actually sort of sounded like something you'd like to read or benefit from. And there you go. It's actually somebody has just pipped me to the post, put something in here. Hard things about hard things. There you go. That's good. And Bruce says that I should end like I started with so long and thanks for all the fish. I think the last one was technically mostly harmless, or I suppose arguably even, and another thing by Owen Colford, but we won't go with that one. But yes, lovely stuff. Thank you very much indeed. So long, thanks for all the fish. Oh, Measure What Matters by John Doerr. That's great. Dweck's Art of Learning. Loads of people throwing a few things in just at the last minute here. So thank you for that. Absolutely brilliant. I'm going to be going through all these comments afterwards. I really appreciate it, everybody. Have a great week, whatever you're doing. My name's Matthew-Hughes. If you want to get in contact with me, obviously connect with me here on LinkedIn, mdh@sandler.com, and my mobile number is 07715 269 724. That is us for another Friday Live. Have a great week. See you soon. Thanks a lot.